So welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I am Kate Clarke Lemay. I use pronouns she, her. I'm just going to get us started now. By introduction, I'm the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery, and I'm the interim director of Portal, which is the Portrait Gallery's scholarly center. Thank you again for joining us today for our presentation entitled Queering Women's Suffrage in the United States. And this lecture will feature Dr. Anya Jabour, Regents Professor of History at the University of Montana, and Dr. Wendy L. Rouse, Associate Professor of History at San José State University. We're so excited to have these brilliant women and minds in conversation with us. Although we are tuning in together today from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. We also recognize that since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. And the National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. So it looks like I see a lot of people are in the chat. It's awesome. Please use the chat function to make your comments, to agree, to think out loud, to let us know from where you're watching. But there's a different function, which is the Q&A function, to ask questions. So please use the Q&A box to pose your questions, and that will be from where I'm going to be reading your questions for our speakers. I just also want to acknowledge our donors. We are pleased to present today's event as part of the Tommie L, Pegues and Donald A Capoccia Conversation Series in LGBTQ portraiture. Tommie and Don join us in our belief that queer history is American history and should be featured in a spotlight conversation series. And so we are so grateful for their support. Thank you again to Tommie and Don. Right now, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Anya Jabour is Regents Professor of History at the University of Montana, where she has taught about the history of women, gender, and sexuality in the US, earning her PhD from Rice University in 1995. She has published widely on the private lives and public roles of women, families, and children in the 19th and 20th century. And she drew upon her experience as a script reviewer and historical consultant for the PBS Civil War docudrama Mercy Street. That is so cool. In addition to her scholarly books and articles, she is a regular contributor to Made by History for the Washington Post. And her most recent book, Sophonisba Breckinridge, Championing Women's Activism in Modern America, which was published with the University of Illinois in 2019, was supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And her research on same-sex relationships and the suffrage movement has been featured in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, Medium, and Them, among other outlets. Her current research project is a biography of Catherine Bevan Davis, and she was an innovative prison administrator and pioneering sex researcher. And we're going to hear a little bit more about her today. So I'm very excited that Anya is joining us. Our other amazing speaker tonight is Wendy Rouse. Wendy Rouse is Professor of History at San José State University. Her research focuses on gender and sexuality, and she is the author of 3 books and numerous articles exploring the history of women and children during the Progressive Era. Her most recent book, Public Faces, Secret Lives, A Queer History of the Women's Suffrage Movement, examines the ways in which suffragists transgressed the gender and sexual norms of their era and pushed the boundaries of respectability. And we're going to hear much more about the whole respectability thing tonight, so I'm so excited. Rouse is also the program coordinator for the History Social Science Teacher Preparation Program at San Jose University, where she works with future educators. In collaboration with community partners such as the California History Social Science Project and the UC Davis History Project, Rouse has designed resources to help educators incorporate LGBTQ+ history into their curriculum. So without further ado, please welcome Anya and Wendy. Thank you so much for turning on your cameras. They're here. So I wanted to just get our conversation started out by thinking about, if we can advance the slide, when we think about the suffrage movement, we immediately picture, well-dressed women with these beautiful conservative clothing, cloaked, in something much more radical, which was underneath, of course, which was how daring they were to demand for more rights in such a conservative era. And so, for example, in this portrait of Ida B. Wells from 1893, this is such an incredible portrait. She's wearing this bodice, this dress whose bodice includes hand-sewn beads on lace, and the thoughtful details that she put, while dressing herself, like the brooch at her throat and the hair comb at the back of her head, they really communicate somebody very proper and very put together, right? So fashion's communicating this kind of image to the world. And it's very much like a defense, really, because Ida B. Wells was a journalist and activist who was arguing for anti-lynching laws. She did all these important things for the suffrage movement, including founding the Alpha Suffrage Club, which is the first Black suffrage club in Chicago in early 1913, just before she marched in the March on Washington with all those incredible women, that famous suffrage parade. So suffrage history, as our audience probably already knows, it's something that the National Portrait Gallery put in the spotlight during our 2019 exhibition, Votes for Women, A Portrait of Persistence. And so it was conceived to help usher in the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And we featured these portraits like the one we are seeing of Ida B. Wells. And as the curator of that show, I wanted to make sure that we address the history of women of color in the suffrage movement. And it became this important show because it addressed such a complicated history. But one question we didn't ask, and the show didn't query, was the role of queer women in the suffrage movement. So I just wasn't sure how to talk about someone's sexuality that they themselves, never named. So I've asked, I really was excited about tonight's program because Anya and Wendy are the experts. And I wanted to first kind of pose this question to both of you. And Wendy, you'll go first, but let's talk about queer history. And how do you define queer history? And how have you navigated this, tricky question of labeling 19th century women's sexuality?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking that too, because that's such an important question. So throughout my research, I use the term queer quite broadly to refer to people that if they were alive today, right, their gender and sexual identity is not rigidly cisgender or heterosexual. Because obviously in this time period that we're looking at, this pre-1920 era, there's no organized LGBTQIA+ movement. Many of the terms that we use today were not in popular usage. So we cannot know what terms they would use to describe themselves in the language that we now use. But we know that queer individuals have always existed. And we know that suffragists expressed a wide range of sexualities and genders. And so I use the term queer broadly to refer to that wide range of genders. And I also use the term queer as a verb to refer to the variety of ways that suffragists were really upending existing social norms, were radically challenging the ideas of their day. So this slide has two postcards. And I think it emphasizes the fact that critics of the women's suffrage movement really did focus on the queerness of the movement. So you can see through this anti-suffrage propaganda that anti-suffragists were especially worried that granting women the right to vote would disrupt the idea of separate spheres, that it would invert white middle-class gender norms, And so you can see in the image on the right, they feared that men would be reduced to subservient domestic activities. They would be doing the laundry, they would be caring for the baby, and that the wife, the suffragist wife, would abandon her domestic duties, essentially emasculating her husband through his loss of power, both inside and outside the home. So these images that anti-suffragists use were really these images that kind of created this mannish or abnormal woman. And so anti-suffragists focused on women who wanted the vote as abnormal, not only because they wanted masculine rights and privileges, but because of the way that they looked through their literal physical appearance. So they pointed to the outfits worn by dress reformers of the era. They pointed to queer clothing and behaviors of the suffragists who were bucking existing gender norms. And they created these anti-suffrage cartoons and these postcards, really mocking them for their appearance. And so in this image, you see Anna Howard Shaw there on the left, and in response to these caricatures created by the anti-suffragists, many suffrage leaders like Anna Howard Shaw developed publicity campaigns that sought to create kind of a new public image of suffragists as these respectable, very womanly women. So Anna Howard Shaw was largely gender nonconforming as a young woman in her youth, but she was faced with a lot of criticism about this, about her mannish appearance. And so she began to kind of reconsider this as she aged. She started to really focus on her public gender presentation by adopting a much more conservative and feminine appearance. And later in her life, as one of the presidents of NASA, she really exhorted other suffragists to conform, at least outwardly in appearance. She wanted to emphasize the societal expectations of feminine behavior and feminine appearance. She wanted to avoid any unnecessary public scrutiny that detracted from her message and the focus of winning the vote. So suffragists like Shaw published portraits of themselves that emphasized their respectability through their clothing, through their accessories, through their pose. And the interesting thing is that that's in direct opposition to other suffragists like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker here, who refused to conform entirely to these gendered expectations. So Walker chose to wear the women's reform outfit and the dress reform outfit, and later on to dress in what was considered men's clothing at the time. And this subjected her to ridicule. She faced harassment from the police, and both inside and outside the suffrage movement, she faced heavy criticism. She was actually arrested many times for her appearance, for appearing in men's clothing. And she told the police, "I don't wear men's clothing, I wear my own clothes." So she was really refusing to acquiesce to the demands of many of the suffrage leaders that she should conform, that she should wear more feminine clothing, she should abandon her commitment to dress reform. And so she posed for portraits, many portraits, in her masculine attire, in these masculine poses. And this really upset the more conservative suffrage leaders, because Walker would widely share these images, especially in the press. And she insisted that the women's rights movement should embrace a broader idea of equality. So this kind of tension that we see between the public appearance and the private lives of suffragists remains a constant theme throughout the suffrage movement. You have non-conformists like Annie Tinker, who's on the right here, who continued to challenge the status quo in their public appearance and behavior. In the early 19-teens, Tinker was well known for her masculine gender expression, for her rejection of binary notions and expectations for women. And she actually appeared in the New York City suffrage parade, leading a cavalry of suffragists on horseback. And the press mocked Tinker for her affinity for mannish clothing. But Tinker was proud. She posed in images like this one, really proud of her personal style and boldly standing outside the norm. But then you have suffragists like Alice Dunbar Nelson, who were challenging gender and sexual norms in their own ways, but maybe not so explicitly in their appearance. So as a Black woman, Dunbar Nelson was especially aware of the importance of combating racist stereotypes regarding Black criminality and sexual immorality. So she believed that her public presentation as a respectable, as a heterosexual married woman really protected her reputation and the reputation of all Black suffragists. So even after she divorced her husband, he passed away, she continued to use the title Mrs. and her ex-husband's name in public appearances. And this implied heterosexuality and the use of the title really protected her from public scrutiny into her private queer life. And we know from Dunbar Nelson's diaries and letters that she had several relationships at various points in her life with men and several same-sex relationships and love affairs. So this kind of choice to adopt a more private life and a public appearance and the range of strategies that we see suffragists using to negotiate their private and public lives really worked for them as individuals. And Anya, you studied several women and two women especially that were more conformist in their approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Wendy. So my biography of Sophonisba Breckinridge, who's on the left here, addresses her lifelong activism, which included, but was not limited to, suffrage activism. And an important part of my book is a discussion of her long-term relationship with a fellow activist, Edith Abbott, who's pictured here on the right. And I think of these two as the quintessential power couple. They worked as a team at the University of Chicago, where they co-founded and co-directed the nation's first social work program affiliated with a research university. And they also worked together in the suffrage movement and in a wide range of other social justice movements. At the same time, they were romantic partners for more than 40 years. And although they did not officially share a residence until the last few years of their lives, they were pretty much inseparable. And then on the rare occasions on which they were apart, they exchanged letters that one can really only understand as love letters that express their longing for one another's companionship, as well as their mutual support and the depth of their connection. So Abbott and Breckinridge had this relationship that was sort of an open secret. Their students, their colleagues, their friends, their family members all acknowledged their relationship. So their students referred to them, remember we're talking about Abbott and Breckinridge here, they referred to them as A and B. Correspondence with one of them always mentions and asks about the welfare of the other, definitely acknowledging them as a couple. And then, especially after Breckinridge's death, Abbott received a flood of condolence letters. And those letters not only offered condolences to Abbott in her grief, but actually praised the relationship as the ideal relationship. But at the same time, nobody ever used the word lesbian or any of the other terminology that we might use now to describe them. Instead, they used very proper 19th century language. As one of their students put it, we always thought of them as the ladies, right? And so these images that are up on screen right now kind of show you how they expressed that identity as ladies, that they adopted very conventionally feminine attire and self-presentation. Breckinridge's very elaborate embroidered bodice, kind of like Ida B. Wells' dress that you saw earlier, marks her elite status, as well as her femininity. And then a little less dressy, but Edith Abbott also appears, quite conventionally feminine. There's definitely no top hat, no trousers, no hint of reform dress like Tinker or Walker in the images that Wendy shared with us. Together with their relatively advanced age, they were in their 50s and 60s at the time of the conclusion of the suffrage movement, as well as their class privilege as well-to-do, white, well-educated women. Their self-presentation seems to have shielded them from any suspicion of lesbianism. One reason for that is that they came of age in the 19th century, before most Americans had any concept of lesbianism. And indeed, most Americans regarded women as completely devoid of sexual passion, and therefore saw same-sex relationships, at least between women, as ideal, precisely because they assumed that they were, by definition, non-sexual in nature. Now, these photos were taken, although they're undated, they're taken in the early 20th century, and by that point, new ideas about women's sexuality and homosexuality in general had begun to circulate. And cultural critics had begun to warn against the dangers of lesbianism, which was now defined both as a sexual perversion and as a contagious condition. But Breckinridge and Abbott seem to have just gone merrily along in their, nice Victorian mindset and maintained this kind of protective coloration of the Victorian era, in which women could enjoy same-sex intimacy precisely because it was not seen as sexual. So here are a couple of full-length photos of just Breckinridge. And you can see here that she continued to wear the long skirts and the elaborate hats typical of the Victorian era well into the 20th century. So these date probably between roughly 1908 and 1915. And again, this clothing announced her identity as a lady rather than a lesbian. I don't have a picture of Abbott dressed this way, but their students described both women walking campus together with their long skirts sweeping the sidewalks and sort of creating a path for themselves, and everyone kind of gave way. And similarly, this elaborate dress provided them with a pathway through their society and with protection against any allegations of lesbianism, which was frequently associated with lower class women and criminals. And of course, Breckinridge and Abbott were neither of those things. So this is one of the only pictures that exists of the two of them together. It's a bit later. You can't actually see their skirts, but they no longer go all the way to the ground, but it's still quite conservative. They still have hats. They still have the elaborate upswept hairdos. This pictures them working together at the University of Chicago's School of Social Service Administration, which is now called the Crown School. And they worked together at this school for about 20 years after they founded it, and they turned it into a kind of platform to shape public policy. And they used it to promote the modern welfare state. So their personal relationship enhanced their political activism, as is very clear in all of their correspondence. So they were kind of outwardly conformist, and yet at the same time, their political commitments were to things like immigrant welfare, African-American civil rights, women's suffrage, world peace, and what they called a national minimum for all Americans. That's the basis of the welfare state. And so even though they were outwardly conformist in their policies, they challenged prevailing attitudes and actually changed national policies.
Yeah, and I think we really see this a lot with these reformers and these queer suffragists, right? They're pushing the boundaries of their day. And so many of them really envisioned a broader women's rights movement. They embraced a variety of issues related to gender, to race, to class, and citizenship. So here you see an image of Dr. Margaret Chung. And Chung really did reject traditional gender norms early on in her career. She pursued a career as a doctor. And Chinese American women like Chung faced blatant discrimination in American society at the time, not only because of their sex, but because of their race. They were alternately demonized and exoticized by a white society fascinated with Chinese culture and heritage. So when reporters would interview Chung, they would often focus on her as almost a novelty, right? As an outsider because of her Chinese heritage. And they would imply essentially that she's somehow not from the United States, even though she was American born. And we see this othering of Chinese American women, and it's perpetuated with the myth of the perpetual foreigner. So Chung's status as a Chinese American, but also her status as a single woman, really subjected her to quite a bit of scrutiny. She never married. She pursued intimate same-sex relationships with women, and she queered the norm early in her career through her gender expression. So she took images where she sought to project herself in this kind of professional, masculine image, and posed for portraits dressed in a man's hat with a cane and a masculine coat. And then one of my favorite suffragists is Alice Morgan Wright, who was less defiant in her gender expression. In most of her formal portraits, she's actually wearing gender-conforming clothing that's very typical of white middle-class women of her era. But if you look carefully at this image and at many of the other images of her, you can kind of do an alternate queer reading, and that really does align and to her private queer life. So in this image, you see her masculine pose, right? Her leg is up on the log, her arm is draped casually across the leg, her head is cocked, and she has a sly grin on her face. It's most definitely this queer expression, right? And so her pose stands in striking contrast to the woman who sits next to her, who is in this more traditionally feminine pose. She's seated with perfect posture. She has this very subdued expression on her face and is holding a bouquet of flowers. And I don't know the relationship between these two, but Wright had many women lovers throughout her life, and especially in college during the era, this time period, during the time period that this image was taken. And she had lots of romantic same-sex relationships. But regardless of the personal choices that they made in their private lives, suffragists really had to be deliberate, and they had to really think about how to manipulate their public presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an image of Catherine Bement Davis, who is a great example of this. So in 1914, Davis became New York City's first female commissioner of corrections. She also was very active in the suffrage movement. And her appointment attracted an enormous amount of media attention, and with all kinds of speculation about what it meant to have a woman and what it meant to have a woman suffragist in office. And for instance, one of her clerks, her male clerks, worried that she was going to redecorate her city office with pink ribbons on all the chandeliers. She didn't, by the way. Davis generally tried to downplay the significance of gender. So for example, when she was asked about her administration, she said it wouldn't be any different from a man's administration. But this was part of her larger strategy of navigating the boundaries between professionalism and femininity. So this particular image came from her first day in office, and it's quite typical, and it received a great deal of media coverage. The roses, the flowers that, as Wendy was just saying, are identified with more conventional femininity, are indeed pink. And her suit, while it's quite tailored, was blue and white, which picked up the color of her eyes, which every journalist pointed out. And then, but interestingly, something you can't see in this photo, but which shows up in some of the written accounts of her first day in office, is that behind her was a blackboard that was absolutely crammed with statistics about the jails and prisons and reformatories that she had responsibility for as Commissioner of Corrections. So Davis understood very well that she had to balance expectations of femininity, including this particular type of appearance, with demands for professionalism, which was associated with masculinity, right? But the way that she did that, rather than, adopting trousers and suits and hats like Dr. Chung and Dr. Walker, was to present herself as a sort of matronly figure. So she exercised maternal authority over the inmates, who she called boys and girls, regardless of their age, in the institutions that she supervised. Davis had to be this careful about her self-presentation because reporters seized on any sign that she was either not feminine enough on the one hand, or that she was too feminine on the other hand. So for example, less than a year into her term, she was called upon to quell a violent uprising among the male inmates of the infamous, justly infamous, Blackwell's Island prison. And at the time that the riot began, she had been attending a soiree held by the socialite suffragist Alva Belmont. And then she went directly from this party to deal with the riot. So because she arrived at the prison in her party gown, some newspapers reported that she dealt with the prisoners at the point of her parasol. Davis herself denied carrying a parasol. But she did quiet the prisoners by kind of, again, balancing professionalism and femininity. So she asserted her authority, and she threatened to call out the militia if necessary, but she won the inmates over by presiding over religious services and actually leading the prisoners in singing hymns. And then afterwards, the inmates wrote her a letter in which they praised her for her motherly care. One final thing that I'll mention about Davis now brings us back to Kate's original question about the prevalence of queer suffragists. So after she stepped down as Commissioner of Corrections, Davis took a position at an anti-vice think tank called the Bureau of Social Hygiene. And the Bureau's mission was to combat prostitution. Davis knew a lot about prostitution because her job before she was Commissioner of Corrections was supervising New York State's first female reformatory, where the majority of inmates had been committed on charges of prostitution or sexual immorality. But while she worked at the Bureau, she became more interested in the actual sexual attitudes and behavior of what she called normal women, by which she meant not criminal women, by which she meant women like herself, white, well-to-do, well-educated. And that study was published in 1929, and it revealed the frequency with which those women like herself, engaged in same-sex relationships. So she distributed a questionnaire to more than 5,000 women. She had 2,200 responses. And among those responses, nearly 1/3 of the married women and 1/2 of the unmarried women reported engaging in intense same-sex relationships. And of those, half of each group, in other words, 1/6 of the married women and 1/4 of the unmarried women, indicated that those relationships included sexual activity. Since the women Davis studied were members of the group and also the generation that guided the suffrage movement, it indicates a very significant proportion of suffragists were what we might now justifiably call queer.
Wow. Okay, so I'm fascinated. This is, I want to dive into all of these women's biographies more, especially, I mean, all of those portraits are just, they're so arresting, really. But I have a couple of questions, and then I want to invite our audience to, start thinking about your questions too. We have 5 great ones so far, but I'd love to double that. So don't hold back. Please use the question and answer box. But I wanted to ask about Catherine Bennett Davis. Did she ever work with the Kinsey Institute, or was she ever tasked by them? Because she clearly had access to a sort of a specific audience.
That is a great question. So actually, she formed the group, which underwent a number of name changes, and all of them are very long, but it's basically the Institute for the Study of Human Sexuality, blah, blah, blah. Right. That's the group that actually, decades after her retirement, funded Kinsey's studies. And Kinsey read and cited her work, but she did not work with him because he came after her. She was the first. She was actually the first woman in the United States to author a study about women's sexuality. And unlike Kinsey, who of course started with men and then added women, she started with women. And she actually would have done a follow-up study on men, but she was fired because the study was too controversial.
Do you think that was because she was a woman?
Well, it was because she was a woman interviewing or asking women about their sex lives. And interestingly, it wasn't so much her revelations about same-sex relationships that were considered the most shocking. What was considered the most shocking is that she asked her subjects about their experiences with masturbation. And she accompanied the questionnaire with a statement that basically said, don't worry about talking about masturbation. It's totally normal and its negative effects have been blown wildly out of proportion. And so people were absolutely horrified that she was inviting respectable, white, well-to-do women to talk about sex that didn't involve, I mean, not only didn't involve men, didn't involve another person. That was sort of what was really beyond the pale as far as some of her male colleagues at the Bureau were concerned.
Interesting. It strikes me that a lot of the suffragists were interested in health and hygiene. I mean, to use the sort of the 19th century, early 20th century terms. And I was also thinking about Wendy's study of Margaret Chung and just what drew her to become a doctor and how hard was that for her? And what did she, can you tell us a little bit more about that part of her biography?
Yeah, that's the early part of her life when she's really, active in a variety of movements. And, she came from a larger family and she was definitely concerned about improving society, improving life for her family and providing financially for them as well. And it was really a tough position to be in, to try to be a woman, to try to be a Chinese woman who's navigating the system. And so later in her life, she actually starts to, again, kind of tinker with her image, and she presents herself in a much more feminine, motherly role in the 1940s and 1950s. And keeping in mind that, homophobia is very strong in that era and whatnot, I think that worked well for her at that point in time as she was trying to kind of navigate a new reality and try to still continue her professional life.
I just find her so fascinating because the suffragists, as you know, and probably a lot of our audience knows, they went to France during World War I as nurses and doctors, they were sponsored by NASA or Smith College sometimes. I mean, they went over, NASA was really kind of trying to, Carrie Chapman Catt was trying to do something for the war effort that was acceptable, that would help sort of prove that these women suffragists were not just burning Woodrow Wilson's speeches in front of the White House, but that they were, conservative and loving of their country. So when I found those stories, I just thought, my goodness, this is like a movie waiting to be made. Like, this is so good. And I think, look, if anyone likes historical romance, Lauren Willig actually wrote a book about the Smith women who went to France. But so there's a lot of really interesting, groundbreaking, or glass ceiling breaking kind of biographies in these queer suffragists specifically that I just keep finding fascinating. But like the two of you are explaining, they had to be very careful about their images. So I'm just wondering, Anya, about Abbott and Breckinridge. Why is there only one photo of them together? Is that just coincidence, or is there something behind that? Can we read into that at all?
Well, that's a good question. They don't really have, there just aren't that many casual photos of them, and the casual photos of them are photos that they took of each other, if you see what I mean, yeah. Right? So of course they can't both be in the photo. I'm not sure that there's a deeper significance to that. I do know that Breckinridge, not, I don't think, to hide the relationship, but just because she thought that she wasn't important enough. So she carefully preserved all of the papers of her male ancestors and family members, and she deposited them at the Library of Congress. But she asked that her own papers be destroyed. But she named Abbott her executor, and Abbott did not destroy them, and indeed added them to the collection at the Library of Congress. And then Abbott has her own collection of papers. And so some of their love letters are in Breckinridge's collection, and some of them are in Abbott's collection. and they don't appear to have been cold, right, in any way. They don't exist and don't exist because they were never apart, and then they'll be apart for a week or a month at a time, and then there's a flood of letters, and then whoop, they're gone again because they're back together, and obviously they had no need to write to each other. So so because they ultimately didn't end up calling their letters, I don't think that they were intentionally obscuring their photos. But yeah, there's nothing like Molly Dewson, Mary W. Dewson, and her partner Polly Porter had a whole scrapbook of their photos together, and they actually called themselves the Porter Dewsons, like with a hyphen, and have like this whole scrapbook of them with their dogs. So adorable. There's nothing like that for Breckinridge and Abbott, unfortunately. I would love it if there were.
I know, it'd be like the dream. Okay, so we're at 5:42, and I just want to start getting to our question. I have a ton more questions. I would love to know more even about like what each of these women did for the suffrage movement, but I want to make sure that we get to our Q&A from our audience. Lorna Grenadier asks, did these suffragists have independent incomes to enable them to be more expressive? Was it more difficult for women of color?
I would say definitely like their class status matters quite a bit in their ability to express themselves. Like Annie Tinker was from a very wealthy family, and this was often a way to be able to dismiss them as like these eccentric women, right? So I think for those that were most kind of bold in their gender expression, that was one way to get around it, was to really emphasize or rely on their class status as kind of a shield. And I think that's the point that we made a lot, is that the middle class status shields them somewhat from other types of scrutiny.
Yeah, and to build on that, Breckinridge, Abbott, and Davis were all self-supporting professional women. So they were middle class, which offered them a certain amount of protection, but they were definitely not wealthy. They had to pay their own way through school, all of them. And they relied on their income to support themselves, and in some cases to support nieces and nephews as well. Breckinridge and Abbott both supported nieces and nephews. So part of the reason I think that they were so careful in their self-presentation was because they understood that their actual livelihoods were at stake. And they did not have the wealth that like Tinker had that might have allowed them to not worry if, that got them dismissed from a job, because they were privileged, but they weren't so privileged that they could afford to get fired.
Yeah, she was kind of ostentatious in a way, Thank you both. Okay, I wanted to ask another question. It was thought that women couldn't have sexual attraction. Was it also thought that they couldn't have romantic attraction? If so, would that mean the general public assumed Abbott and Breckinridge's relationship was strictly platonic?
That is a wonderful question, and this is one of these places, as Kate indicated before, that it gets really messy, because in the 19th century and into the 20th, depending on who you're talking to, romantic and sentimental and loving did not necessarily connote sexual. And indeed, many 19th century Americans had negative associations with sexuality, but positive associations with romantic love. And so they certainly saw these friendships as being romantic, but they saw them as being extra romantic because it was, just, right, romantic. But that's not the same thing as platonic, right? I mean, they were definitely romantic relationships, but it's that they drew the lines between different types of relationships a bit differently than later generations, including our own.
Was the 19th century like super sentimental too, and people could really get away, like women and women? I had like my grandmother, great grandmother, as some kind of daily diary, right, of, I don't know, something she would read, a calendar of sorts, and it was so romantic and sentimental, and it was gifted to her by a female friend.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the letters are just gushy. And even men in the 19th century wrote, I mean, even though, I mean, there was a concept of male homosexuality in a way that there was not a concept of lesbianism earlier in the 19th century and before for men. But even men in the 19th century wrote these incredibly gushy, ooey gooey love letters to one another because it was, yeah, I mean, it was kind of like, I mean, on the one hand, it was the style. On the other hand, the fact that it was the pervading style meant that it was perfectly safe for women who loved other women or men who loved other men to engage in that kind of sentimental, romantic, flowery, very flowery language because, you know, it was sort of not remarkable. Or if it was remarkable in the sort of sense of like, oh, you have the ideal relationship, not in the therefore you must be lesbians kind of way that it would become a little further into the 20th century.
I have a good question for Wendy from Hélène Conquin. What did suffrage represent to the queer suffragists? Oh, this is for both you and Anya. Sorry, let me start over. What did suffrage represent to the queer suffragists you both studied? An end in itself? Probably not. A gateway to an expanded vision of female/queer citizenship? Something important but not so essential? Wendy, you mentioned that you use the verb to queer. So how do you think these suffragists specifically queered the suffrage movement and queered suffrage as both a demand and a practice? Wow, great complicated question.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I have a whole book that covers a lot of it. But thank you for those questions, especially I think it's really important to think about what queer suffragists really were hoping for with the suffrage movement. And I think this is one of the most interesting things is that, you know, the suffrage movement meant different things to different women. For some, they're focused on the vote, but for most of them, they saw the vote as like the first step to greater equality. And for what that each individual, what equality meant to each individual really varied. So for queer suffragists, for many of them, it meant the ability to not have to depend upon another person's income. So if you get the vote, right, then you can push for broader changes, including like equal pay, access to education, access to the professions. And this would allow you some financial independence that would free you from dependence on having to get married or rely on a man for that support. So if you're a queer woman, this is an opportunity to have that independence, to live your own life, to not get married. And I think it's the same for gender nonconforming suffragists as well, right? That economic independence affords them some ability to kind of let go of what expectations were for women. So that's definitely, I think, one of the key things is to keep in mind that what the vote meant varied substantially from individual to individual. And then you ask about how did suffragists queer the movement? And I address this in multiple ways in the book. I talk about the ways in which they queered notions of family by creating their own chosen families, how they queered their domestic arrangements, like who they lived with, and how they created these really non-heterosexual arrangements, non-heteronormative family arrangements. I look at how they queer death ritual, especially as they age into the later part of the 20th century and kind of adopt and adapt heteronormative death rituals for their queer lives. I look at how they queer public space and how they really challenge the ideas of who belongs in certain spaces and upend existing gender norms. So I think that there's a variety of ways to use queer as a verb here when you're looking at the ways that suffragists challenge these ideas.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that Wendy said. And I have to say, I think her family chapter and her death chapter are two of the most exciting chapters in her book. I would say that for Breckinridge and Abbott, who, and that book's actually written, whereas the Davis one, I'm just getting started on. For Breckinridge and Abbott, suffrage was definitely just one piece of the puzzle, and they were just as much, if not more, concerned with advancing social justice writ large, right? So well before they were involved in the suffrage movement, they were involved in advocacy on behalf of working women and working class women. And they were very committed to African-American civil rights, which is especially interesting in the case of Breckinridge because she was the daughter of a Confederate officer from Kentucky, not somebody you would expect to be a champion for Black equality, but she was. They were, just as concerned with world peace. They were just as concerned with establishing what would become the welfare state and the Social Security Act. So they saw suffrage as just like, as something that marked women's equality and that certainly women deserved, but also as a tool to achieve these other ends, all of which kind of were part of this larger puzzle of creating a more just society. In the case of how they queered the suffrage movement, if you use it as a verb, I definitely think of that in the really wide way that Wendy's talking about it as just like changing it, reshaping it in different ways, because Breckinridge and Abbott also contested the more conservative, nativist, racist, classist elements of the suffrage movement. And so whereas many suffrage leaders, I should say, attempted to exclude immigrants and African Americans, for example, by advocating for literacy tests that would enfranchise well-educated white women, but disfranchise immigrant and African American men, as well as women. They always advocated for a much broader definition of citizenship for all people of all backgrounds. So they, in that sense, when you use queer as a verb to describe them, they were kind of queering the suffrage movement at a meta level by demanding that it be really inclusive.
Much more inclusive. Thank you. That was a great question. And then I didn't mean to, it was just like, there was a lot to unpack there. So thank you both for tackling that. Randolph Hollingsworth asks, did any of these women interact with or reflect on the cultures of Native American people who allowed for more than only two genders?
No, not that I know of. So that's all I have to say. Wendy, do you know?
Yeah, I mean, not that I know of, not that any of them were aware of two-spirit identities. There were Indigenous women who were suffragists, and Kathleen Cahill's book really does a great job of talking about their role in the suffrage movement.
Yeah, and we have a portal lecture that you are welcome to look at from our YouTube page, where Kathleen is talking about Native American women and the right to vote. So I'd love to, if we can find that and put it in the chat before the lecture ends, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, there's also a new book by Sally Wagner that's about the earlier generation of suffragists and how they looked at the example of the Haudenosaunee, for example. I have not yet read that book, however, so I don't know how deeply she goes into what they knew or thought they knew about Indigenous women and Indigenous gender and sexuality and how that influenced their outlook. I just noticed it this week.
It's a great book. The YouTube is in the chat, so you can look at that too. Renee Smith asks, hi, Wendy, I am in the middle of your latest book, Public Faces, Secret Lives. Given that Black suffragists had a complex rights agenda within their own community, did NASA and NWP ever move forward in a more cohesive way to join efforts for women's rights overall?
Well, I think that's the big question and the big debate and discussion that was held, especially around the centennial, is just how much NASA and the National Women's Party did not advocate for Black women's rights, and even at the urging of Black suffragists who insisted that the national organizations needed to do more to protect Black women's right to vote and to continue to fight even after the passage of the 19th Amendment for enfranchisement, that essentially didn't happen. And in many ways, the NWP and NASA worked against Black suffragists and their agenda. And I think this ties into that whole respectability politics thing, right? Because as much as it was an individual choice, it had a huge impact when it was adopted by a movement. So when the mainstream suffrage leaders are advocating for this respectability approach, essentially what that does is it marginalizes the most marginalized in the movement. So not only queer women and gender nonconforming women, but Black suffragists and other suffragists of color and Indigenous suffragists. It basically moves their concerns to the extreme. And in essence, they abandon those concerns. And so the respectability of politics really fails these suffragists.
Anya, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like I said, it was kind of a blip when Breckinridge, along with Jane Addams, were co-vice presidents of NASA. And they really challenged the exclusivity and the classism and the racism and the nativism of the movement by, for example, inviting W.E.B. Du Bois to speak. And Du Bois had publicly called out the suffrage movement for being about votes for white women only, right? So by inviting him to speak, they were trying to shift the conversation to be more inclusive. But they tangled with the rest of the leadership team, including Anna Howard Shaw, and their tenure was very short as vice presidents. It was less than 2 years. So yeah, and Davis also was a vice president, like a third vice president, a bit later. I have not yet really dug into her suffrage record, so I'm not sure what she did there. She prided herself on being the daughter of a woman, the granddaughter, sorry, of a woman who was both an abolitionist and a suffragist, who had purportedly worked on the Underground Railroad in Western New York State, as well as going to the original Seneca Falls Convention. And so
very progressive.
Yeah, so Davis, who's named for that grandmother, it was Rhoda Bement. And so Catherine Bement Davis always insisted on using the Bement in honor of her grandmother. And she, especially during her time at Bedford, the female reformatory, she refused to segregate the inmates by race, which was very unusual. And she eventually got into trouble for that. But I am not sure if she continued her campaign for, racial equality after Bedford. That was one of the reasons that she left Bedford, was actually because of a scandal about same-sex interracial relationships.
Oh, whoa.
At Bedford.
Well, this is great because obviously you have a book forthcoming about this woman, about Catherine Bennett Davis, and I'm really excited to read it because she's clearly, there's so much to take from her biography. And one of our questions was about her and Jane, or the Abbott and Breckinridge with Jane Addams. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I do have the unfortunate responsibility of closing our lecture, but I have a feeling our audience was really eating this up, and I just want to thank the two of you again so much for your incredible knowledge and expertise and for sharing it with us. Before we leave, I just want to just remind people who might be tracking Portal that our next Portal program is going to be on September 9th at 5 p.m. Eastern time. It's going to be in person and wonderful because our essay prize winner is going to be giving a lecture. Dr. Tiffany Barber will be giving a lecture during the prize ceremony for winning this year's Director's Essay Prize for her article titled Narcissus Sister, a Truly Kinky Artist, which was published in Art Journal's Spring 2020 issue. And her talk is titled Black Women's Visual Alterity. And I'm so excited. It's not going to be great to, hear more from Dr. Barber about her work, but it's also just going to be so nice to be in person. So those of you who are in Washington, please come on over. I hope you can join us. And our next virtual program is going to be on September 13th at 5 p.m. And it is entitled Understanding Sylvia Rivera. Again, sponsored by Tommie Pegues and Donald Capoccia. And it's going to be a conversation between my colleague, Mindy Farmer, and professors Julio Capo and Larry LaFontaine Stokes about the life and legacy of Sylvia Rivera, whose portrait we have on view. So it's going to be really great to talk about transgender activists. There's a link in the chat for you all to sign up. I hope that you do. And that is all I've got. So thanks again to Wendy and Anya, and thank you to the Portal team for helping us. And thanks to all of you for coming. Bye.